The Pacific did not wake gently here. It moved in long gray pulses against a coastline that had been chewed and rechewed for 10,000 years, and the dunes above the tide line rose and fell like the back of some sleeping animal that had forgotten the men who walked across it. Salt fog hung in the low places. The wind off the water carried the smell of kelp and old wood and something colder underneath, something mineral and ancient, the smell of a place that had swallowed ships and fishermen and would swallow more before the century turned. The dunes themselves were not still. They shifted in the dark, grain by grain, reshaping themselves around whatever the wind chose to bury. A boot print laid down at sunset would be gone by midnight. A body laid down at midnight would be gone by morning. The land had no memory and no mercy, and the men who trained on it learned early that the ground beneath them was not an ally. It was a witness, indifferent and patient, and it had watched a great many things. To the east, the coastal range held back the inland heat and pushed the marine layer down across the sand in slow white sheets. To the west, the Pacific stretched out flat and gunmetal toward a horizon that gave no information. Between the two, in a corridor maybe 4 kilometers wide and 12 long, the United States Navy had drawn a rectangle on a classified map and called it a training range. The range had a number. It did not have a name. The men who used it called it the pit, or the box, or sometimes nothing at all, because some places did not need a name to be understood. A hawk turned in a slow circle above the highest dune, 400 feet up, riding a thermal that the rising sun was just beginning to build. Below the hawk, the sand was still cold. The fog had not yet burned off. Surf collapsed against the beach in long exhalations and pulled back, collapsed and pulled back, the rhythm of a thing that had been breathing for longer than any human history could measure. It was 5:47 on the final morning of a 14-day exercise. The men were already moving. They had been moving for 6 hours, and they did not know yet that one of them would be carried out before the sun cleared the ridge. Senior Chief Ray Mendel took point because he always took point on the last day. He was 39 years old and built like a length of cable, lean and rope-veined, and the lines at the corners of his eyes had been put there by 2 decades of squinting into bad light. He had been married twice and divorced twice, and he carried, folded into a small square inside the inner pocket of his plate carrier, a drawing his daughter had made him when she was 7. She was 11 now. He had not unfolded the drawing in 2 years. He did not need to. He knew the shape of it through the fabric. Mendel moved with the economy of a man who had stopped wasting motion sometime in his late 20s. His weapon rode loose in his hands, muzzle low, his head turning in slow, even sweeps that took in the dune line, the sky, the sand between his boots, and then the dune line again. He did not think about extraction. He did not allow himself to. He thought about the next 40 meters, and then the 40 after that, and that was the whole of his world. Behind him, at 6 meters, came Petty Officer First Class Eli Brandt, the team's sniper and lead overwatch. Brandt was 33. He had been a competitive shooter before he was a SEAL, and he carried a precision rifle with the comfortable weight of a man carrying a tool he had grown into. His brother had hanged himself in a garage in Spokane 14 months ago. Brandt did not talk about it. He looked through scopes a great deal, and he had begun, sometime in the last year, to see his brother's face in the empty windows of buildings he was meant to be clearing. He had not mentioned this to anyone. He believed it would pass. Petty Officer Second Class Sam Ackafer walked at the 3rd position with the comms gear strapped across his back. He was 29, had an engineering degree from Georgia Tech, and he talked more than the rest of the team combined. He was talking now softly, to no one in particular, narrating the sand and the fog and the way the gulls had not yet started screaming. Ackafer was the team's heart, and they all knew it, and they all pretended not to. Ackafer. Chief. Quiet. Quiet, Chief. He went quiet for about 12 seconds. Behind Ackafer came Petty Officer First Class Wyatt Kerrigan, with the team's heavy weapon balanced across his forearms. Kerrigan was 31 and had grown up on a cattle ranch in the panhandle of Idaho. He was soft-spoken to the point of near silence, and he prayed before every operation, every patrol, every live fire. He was praying now, his lips moving without sound, a habit so private that even after 4 years his teammates pretended not to see it. He was asking, as he always asked, for the wisdom to do what he had to do and the strength to carry whatever it cost him afterward. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Hollis walked fifth. He was 27, from the east side of Detroit, and he had a tongue like a straight razor. Hollis was the team's edge, the one who said what the others were thinking, the one who pushed when pushing was needed. He had been close with Akaffer since Bud S, and he showed it by insulting him constantly. He was working on a comment about Akaffer's narration when Mendel had said quiet, and he was now holding the comment in reserve for later. Hospital corpsman Jonah Reyes came sixth, the medical ruck riding high on his shoulders. Reyes was 30. He had lost a Marine in Helmand 14 months ago, a kid named Ramirez, and the loss had taken something out of his hands. They shook sometimes now in the quiet hours when he was alone and there was nothing to do with them. They did not shake when he was working. He had tested this. He trusted his hands to come back to him when they were needed, and so far they always had. And at the rear, at the 7th position, came Seaman Caleb Doyle. He was 22 years old, and this was his first exercise with the team. He had come off a Montana wheat farm by way of San Diego and Coronado, and he had not yet learned how to stop watching everything. His head moved too much. His eyes were too wide. He was trying very hard to copy Mendel's economical stride, and he was failing. And he knew he was failing, and the knowing was making it worse. Doyle was thinking as he walked about his mother. He was thinking that he would call her when they got back to base. He was thinking that he would not tell her about the cold or the sand in his teeth or the way Hollis had laughed at him on day 3 for the way he held his rifle. He would tell her the weather was fine. He would tell her he was eating. He would tell her he loved her, and she would cry a little, and he would pretend not to hear it. The 7 of them moved north along a corridor of low dunes, the surf to their left at a distance of perhaps 200 meters, the inland ridge to their right at a distance of perhaps 400. The fog lay between them and the water in a soft white wall. The sun, somewhere behind the coastal range, was beginning to suggest itself. They had been on this range for 14 days. They were tired in the specific way that men become tired when they have not been allowed to sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch. They were also, every one of them, a few hours from being done. The dune they crested at 6:12 was higher than the others, and from its crown the beach revealed itself, a long pale curve of sand running north into the fog. Somewhere out past the surf line, perhaps 1,000 meters offshore, a small dark shape sat low on the water. The Zodiac, 2 hours early. Mendel allowed himself to exhale through his nose. It was the closest thing to relief he permitted himself on an active patrol. The men behind him saw the line of his shoulders ease by perhaps a centimeter, and they read the centimeter correctly, and something passed through the formation that was not quite hope, but was related to it. Brant lowered his scope for the first time in an hour. His shoulders ached. He rolled them once slowly, and felt the dull burn of a man who had been carrying the same 5 extra kilograms in the same position for too long. Doyle, at the rear, allowed himself one full breath of cold salt air and thought again about his mother, and about a phone, and about a hot shower, and about sleeping for 16 hours in a bed that did not have sand in it. He smiled, very slightly, beneath the lower edge of his face wrap. It was 6:13 when the first round came. It made almost no sound. There was a sound, but it was wrong, a soft compressed chuff that the wind almost carried away before any of them could place it. Suppressor. Subsonic load. The round itself arrived half a second after the noise of its leaving. And it arrived at the 3rd man in the line. Sam Akaffer's left hand and forearm came apart in a way that the human eye registers as motion before it registers as injury. The radio harness across his chest jerked sideways. He made a sound that was not quite a word. He went down on his right knee first, and then onto his side, and the sand around him began to darken in a slow, uneven spread. For perhaps 2 seconds, No one in the formation moved. This was the longest 2 seconds of Caleb Doyle's life. Then training arrived, the way it does, like a thing that has been waiting just behind the door. Down, down, down. Mendel's voice did not rise. It did not need to. The whole team was already moving toward the sand, low and fast, weapons up, eyes sweeping. Reyes was on Akaffer before Akaffer had finished falling, his hands already going through their familiar sequence, the shaking gone, the medic's brain online. Direction, direction, anybody. Brandt's scope swept the inland ridge in a smooth, practiced arc. Kerrigan covered the southern approach. Hollies took the north. Doyle, at the rear, had turned to face the sea because nobody else was facing it, and because he had been taught that the direction nobody was looking was the direction the next round would come from. Nothing. The dunes lay perfectly still. The fog was thinner now, peeling back in slow strips, but where it had peeled back there was only sand and sage and the small dark shapes of driftwood thrown up by some long-forgotten storm. No muzzle flash. No movement. No shape that did not belong. No flash. No flash. Negative. Negative, Chief. The negatives came back one by one, and Mendel absorbed each of them and did not let his face change. Akaffer was talking. He was saying very quietly that he was fine. He was saying it the way men say it when they are not fine, when they are watching their own body do something their body is not supposed to do, and the only available response is to lie about it gently. Reyes was working a tourniquet up the ruined arm with the kind of speed that looks slow because every motion is in exactly the right place. Sam, look at me. I'm here. Stay here. The radio was gone. The round had gone through Akaffer's forearm and into the housing of the primary set, and the housing had absorbed enough of it to save Akaffer's life and end any hope they had of calling for help. The secondary, in Akaffer's ruck, came out in 2 pieces when Hollies pulled it free. Something had gone into that too. Something small. A second round or a fragment or just very bad luck, and the difference did not matter now. The silence after a shot is louder than the shot. Every man on the team felt it. The wind continued. The surf continued. A gull, somewhere over the water, began to scream and then thought better of it and was quiet again. And in the quiet, every grain of sand seemed to be listening, and every dune seemed to be watching, and the fog peeled back further and showed them nothing at all. They moved. There was nothing else to do. To stay was to die slowly. To move was to die possibly. Mendel chose possibly, the way leaders do, and the team folded itself into a bounding Overwatch pattern and began the long, slow crawl north toward the beach. Kerrigan and Hollies carried Akaffer between them in a modified fireman's drag, Reyes alongside with one hand on the tourniquet and his medical ruck swinging. Brandt took the high ground where he could find it, scope up, breathing slow. Mendel led. Doyle, the rookie, the FNG, brought up the rear, and his head did not stop moving. The first observation came from Brandt, 22 minutes after the shot. He had stopped on a small rise, scoped the back trail, and then walked 5 meters off the line and crouched and picked something out of the sand with 2 gloved fingers. A spent casing, brass, long. The neck was clean, recently fired, and the head stamp was a load Brandt knew well because he had loaded it himself in a different life. Match grade 308. He turned the casing in his glove. This shouldn't be here. It shouldn't have been there because the angle was wrong. The shot had come from the inland ridge, or had seemed to, and this casing was lying on a dune nearly perpendicular to that line. A shooter who fired from the ridge did not leave brass on a dune 400 meters south of the ridge, unless he had fired from the dune. And if he had fired from the dune, then the ridge had been the lie, and the lie had been the point. Brandt slipped the casing into a pouch on his vest. He did not say what he was thinking. He did not have to. The second observation came from Kerrigan, who had been watching the wind. The wind off the Pacific had been steady from the west-northwest all morning, perhaps 8 knots, perhaps 10. A shot from the inland ridge would have crossed that wind at near 90 degrees. The drift on a subsonic load at that range would have been significant. Significant enough that a shooter would have to know the wind down to the half-knot to put a round through a moving man's forearm and into the radio behind it. "He's been in position a while," Kerrigan said, very quietly to Mendel. "He's read this wind for hours." Mendel nodded once. The third observation came from Hollies. They had bounded another 200 meters when he stopped, dropped to one knee, and looked at a patch of sand at the base of a small dune. The sand had been disturbed, not by boots, not by an animal. The pattern was wrong. The grains had been smoothed, then scuffed back into something that looked almost natural. Almost. Someone brushed this out. Hollies ran a gloved finger across it. Couple hours ago, maybe more. Mendel knelt beside him and looked. Then he looked up slowly at the dune above the disturbed patch. The dune was unremarkable. It was perhaps 3 meters high and ran maybe 20 meters along its crest. The sage on its leeward side was the same sage as on every other dune. Nothing about it was different. That, Mendel understood with a slow cold turning in his stomach, was the point. The fourth observation came from Mendel himself, and he gave it to no one. He gave it to the inside of his own skull, where it sat and grew. The patrol route they had walked this morning had been on the training schedule. The training schedule was an internal document. The internal document was distributed to a defined list of personnel. The list included instructors. The list included former instructors who had not yet been cleanly removed from the distribution. The list included, in other words, men who had once worn the same patches as the men now bleeding into the sand. Mendel did not say this. He filed it, he kept walking. The fifth observation came from Doyle. Doyle had been at the rear, and his head had been moving the whole time, and his head had been moving because he did not yet trust himself to know which direction to look. He looked at all of them. He looked at the sage and the driftwood and the gulls and the fog and the small white shells half buried in the dune faces. He looked at everything because he did not yet know what was important. What he saw was a single fiber. It was caught on the thorn of a low sage branch about 4 meters off the team's line of march. It was perhaps 2 centimeters long. It was the color of old straw or old burlap, the color of a thing that had been dyed and then bleached and then dyed again by sun and salt. It was the kind of fiber that came off a ghillie suit when a man brushed past sage at a low crawl. Doyle stopped. He did not call out. He did not yet trust his voice. He stepped sideways off the line, picked the fiber off the thorn, and held it up between his thumb and forefinger. "Jiva." Mendel turned, saw what Doyle was holding, crossed the 4 meters in 3 strides. "Where?" "This branch right here." Mendel looked at the branch. He looked at the angle. He looked at the line the branch made with the dune they had just passed and the dune they had not yet reached, and he saw, for the first time, what the geometry was telling him. "He's already moved." Mendel's voice was very quiet. "He's behind us or he's beside us." It was at that exact moment that the second round came. It came from a completely different angle than the first. It came from the west, from the seaward side, from a dune that the team had been walking past for the last 90 seconds. Mendel was turning when it hit him, and the turning saved his life. The round took a long, shallow furrow across the meat of his left shoulder, across the top of the trapezius, deep enough to part the muscle and shallow enough to keep going past it. He went down on one knee. His weapon stayed up. Down, down, down. The team flattened. Brant's scope was already sweeping the seaward dune, and his scope found nothing, nothing, nothing. He swept it again. Nothing. The dune sat there in the thinning fog like a dune. Sage, sand. The faint stripe of a tide line further down. No shape, no shadow, no man. Reyes crawled to Mendel and started in on the shoulder. Mendel waved him off, then let him work. 2 shooters. Maybe, Brant said. He did not lower the scope. Maybe one moving fast. From the ridge to the sea in 20 minutes, Holly's quote-s voice was tight. Through what? Through the dunes, Brant said. Low belly crawl the whole way. It was possible. It was possible the way running a 4-minute mile was possible. It required a man who had decided, somewhere in his life, that there was no such thing as too slow. The comms were dead. They had been dead since the first round. Okafor was conscious and gray. Mendel-S shoulder was bleeding through Ray's-S pressure bandage in a slow, steady seep. The Zodiac was still 1,000 meters offshore and had no way to know that anything had happened on the beach because the beach was empty, and the men who should have been walking onto it were lying on their bellies in the sand half a kilometer inland, listening to a wind that told them nothing. The fog burned off in the next 10 minutes. The sun cleared the coastal range and laid a hard, low light across the dunes, and the light revealed nothing that had not been revealed before. The dunes were still dunes. The sage was still sage. The man who was hunting them was somewhere inside that landscape, and the landscape was not going to give him up. They moved again. They had to. Mendel set a course that took them along a low corridor between two dune lines, the worst possible terrain for an ambush and the only terrain they had. He moved slower now. Ray's had cinched the bandage tight enough that the bleeding had mostly stopped, but the shoulder was stiffening, and the left arm was beginning to refuse small instructions. Brant walked with his scope at his eye for the entire next 300 meters. He saw nothing. He saw nothing the way a man sees nothing when something is there. Doyle, still at the rear, had stopped trying to copy Mendel-S stride. He was watching the dunes the way Mendel watched them. He had learned in the last 40 minutes how to look. It was Doyle who saw it. He had moved up the line during the last bound, because Mendel had pulled him forward to put younger eyes on the seaward approach. He was at the second position now, behind Brant, when the dune ahead of them did the thing he would remember for the rest of his life. It moved. A section of the dune, perhaps 1.5 meters across, on the leeward face about 40 meters to their nor-northeast, shifted. Sand fell away in a slow, soft cascade. What had been a dune face became, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, the shape of a man. He was on one knee, then on his feet. He was wearing a ghillie that was the exact color of the sand around him, that had been the exact color of the sand around him because he had been buried in it. Burlap strips hung from his arms and shoulders. His face was painted in 3 tones of tan. His rifle was already coming to his shoulder. Doyle saw him before Brant did. Doyle was shouting before he knew he was shouting. Contact, 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 12 o'clock high. Brant-S scope snapped to the new bearing. The rest of the team was already dropping, weapons coming up, the bounding pattern collapsing into a hasty firing line along the corridor's eastern lip. The sniper was not running. He was not panicking. He was, in the strange suspended second that Doyle would replay in his head for years, adjusting. He had been seen, and he had absorbed the fact of being seen, and he was now doing the next thing in his sequence, which was to put the round he had been saving into the man with the scope. He almost did. Brant fired first by perhaps 1/10 of a second, and the round went wide because the sand under Brant-S left elbow shifted, and his shoulder dipped 1/2 centimeter at the wrong moment, and the round took a furrow out of the dune 2 meters left of the sniper's head. The sniper fired in answer. The round passed through the empty air where Brant-S face had been a 1/4 second earlier, because Brant was already rolling. And then the sniper was gone again. He had dropped behind the crest. The dune held him. The dune was, the team understood with a slow horror, his ally. But they had seen him. They had seen his face. It was not a face any of them had expected. It was not a foreign face. It was not a young face. It was the face of a man perhaps in his early 50s, weathered down to bone and gristle, the kind of face that had been outside for 40 years. The patches on his ghillie, where the burlap had pulled back at the shoulder, were American patches. The cut of his rifle was a rifle that came out of a school that had taught half the men on this team how to shoot. Brant was the one who said it. He said it through his teeth, with the scope still up. "I know him." "What?" "I know him, sniper school. He was an instructor, Marines, Vance, Teddy Vance." "Marine." Marine Scout Sniper, Gunny, he was a teacher chief. Mendel absorbed this the way he had absorbed every other thing that morning. His face did not change. Inside his chest, something old and tired turned over once and was quiet. Was he got out, 18 months. I heard he was hurt, TBI thing, bad discharge, I didn't. It's him. It's him. Mendel looked at the dune that had opened. He looked at the line of the man's withdrawal. He looked at the corridor of sand between his team and the man who had once stood at a chalkboard and taught men how to do exactly what he was now doing to them. The sniper would reposition. He would come up again, somewhere along the next ridge, and the next round would not miss. He had 2 more in him, maybe 3, before the team could close on his position. 2 more rounds in this terrain with this shooter was 2 more men down, possibly 3, possibly all of them if he was as good as Brant's face was saying he was. The math was bad. The math was very, very bad. It was Doyle who solved it. He solved it the way the young sometimes solve things, by not yet knowing that what he was about to do was impossible. He dropped his pack. Doyle. I got it, Chief. Doyle, no. But Doyle was already moving. He came up out of the corridor in a low, hard sprint, his rifle across his chest, his head down, his boots throwing sand. 40 meters of open ground. No cover, no concealment. Just sand and sage and the slow white sun and a man on the other side of a dune who was very good at his job. Behind him, the team did the only thing the team could do. Brant fired into the dune crest. Hollies opened up with the heavy weapon, and the rounds chewed a long, ragged line across the top of the ridge in a sustained burst that swallowed every other sound. Kerrigan, beside him, walked a second line of fire 10 meters to the left, denying the sniper any clean lane to come back up. Mendel, one-armed, fired his sidearm in slow, careful pulses at the angles the rifle could not cover. Reyes, with Okafor, lay flat across the wounded man's body and aimed his sidearm at the seaward approach, in case there was a second man none of them had yet seen. The volume of fire from the SEAL line was not designed to kill. It was designed to make the sand around Teddy Vance's head into something he could not lift his head out of. It was designed to buy a 22-year-old farm kid from Montana 40 meters of open ground. It bought him 38. At 38 meters, the sniper came up. He came up not at the crest where the SEAL fire was thickest, but at a point 8 meters east in the lee of a sage clump, and he had his rifle, and he had his angle, and he had perhaps 2 seconds. He saw Doyle. Doyle saw him. Doyle did not stop. He did not raise his rifle. The rifle was wrong for the distance, wrong for the speed, wrong for what his hands needed to do in the next second and a half. He let the sling carry it, and he drew his sidearm at a dead run, and he closed the last 15 meters with his pistol up. The sniper's rifle was a precision weapon. It was built to put a round into a man's chest at 800 meters. It was not built for 15. The man behind it knew this. The man behind it had taught it. The man behind it was, in the half-second he had remaining, trying to decide whether to drop the rifle and go for his own sidearm or to take the shot he had. He took the shot he had. It went past Doyle's ear at a distance of perhaps 3 centimeters. Doyle heard it the way you hear something that has already decided not to kill you. He did not flinch. He did not slow. He put 2 rounds into the center of the sniper's chest at a range of 11 meters, and a third round into the same place at a range of 9. And the man who had once been Gunnery Sergeant Theodore Vance, United States Marine Corps, retired, sat down very slowly in the sand of a coast he had probably trained on himself. 20 years ago, when he was the age of the boy who had just killed him. The covering fire stopped. The dunes went quiet in stages. First the rifles, then the echo of the rifles, then the wind which had not actually stopped but seemed to, then last the surf which had never stopped and never would, the long, slow exhalation of the Pacific against the same beach it had been touching for 10,000 years. Doyle stood over the body for a long time before he sat down beside it. The team came up slowly. Brant first, then Hollis and Kerrigan with their weapons still up, sweeping the surrounding dunes for the second man none of them quite believed in anymore. There was no second man. There had never been a second man. There had only ever been Teddy Vance, alone, who had buried himself in sand at 1900 the previous evening and lain motionless through 14 hours of cold and dark, and the slow tightening of his own joints, because he had decided, somewhere in the wreckage of his last 18 months, that the men who came down this corridor on the final morning of the cycle were going to remember him. Mendel knelt beside Doyle. He did not say good shot. He did not say you saved us. He did not say any of the things a movie would have had him say. He looked at the dead man's face for a long time, and then he looked at Doyle's face, and then he reached out with his good arm and put his hand on the back of Doyle's neck the way a father puts a hand on the back of a son's neck. Breathe. Chief. Breathe, son. Doyle breathed. The body in front of them was an older man than any of them had expected. The ghillie had pulled back at the shoulder when he fell, and the unit tattoo on his upper arm was faded and blue and 40 years old. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent a great deal of his life around rifles. His face, even slack, was a face that had taught things. There was a small scar along his jawline that Brant would later remember from a classroom photograph he had seen exactly once, in the back of a manual, in a different life. The rifle lay across the man's chest. It was an immaculate weapon. It had been cared for the way men care for things they love. Doyle looked at it for a long time. He did not touch it. The Zodiac came in at 7:41. The crew on board had heard the heavy weapons fire from 1,000 meters out and had radioed it up the chain, and by the time they reached the beach there were 3 helicopters inbound and a Coast Guard cutter pivoting north. The medical team took Akaffer first, then Mendel. The rest of the team stood on the beach and watched their wounded go up into the sky. Doyle stayed on the dune. He sat in the sand beside Teddy Vance's body and he did not speak, and after a while Mendel, who had refused the second helicopter and was now wrapped in a blanket with his good arm in a sling, came up the dune and sat beside him. They sat there together, 2 men, one young and one old, on a coast that did not care about either of them. He was one of us, Doyle said finally. Yes. What happened to him? Mendel thought about this for a long time before he answered. The thing that we do, son, the thing they teach us, it takes something out of a man. We give a lot of it back, most of us, when we're done. We come home and we do the work of putting ourselves back together and most of us get most of the way there. He looked at the body. Some of us don't. Some of us get hurt in the wrong place at the wrong time and the system that broke us doesn't know how to put us back together. And then we are left with the training and nothing to do with it. Doyle did not answer. I don't know what happened to him, Mendel said. I don't know what he was thinking when he buried himself out here. I'm not going to know. But I know he was made by the same hands that made me. And I know that 30 years from now, if the wrong things happen to you in the wrong order, that could be you out there, or me, or any of us. Doyle looked at the rifle. Is that what we are? That's what we can be, Mendel said. What we are is up to us, every day for the rest of it. The wind came up off the water and moved a long, slow sheet of sand across the leeward face of the dune. It moved over Teddy Vance's boots. It moved over the edge of the hide where he had lain for 14 hours. By the time the recovery team arrived to take the body out, the hide was already half erased, and by the time the sun was at its high point the dune had no memory of him at all. Doyle was the last one off the beach. He carried his pack on one shoulder and his rifle on the other, and he walked through the surf line to the Zodiac and he did not look back. He had stopped watching everything. He had learned in the last 3 hours what was worth watching and what was not. He sat in the bow of the Zodiac as it pulled away from the shore. The dunes receded behind him, lower and lower against the sky, until they were only a long pale line at the edge of the Pacific. The line did not move. The line was the same line it had been at dawn. The land had taken what had happened and folded it into itself and was, as it had always been, indifferent. Somewhere inside Caleb Doyle, very quietly, a young man finished and another man began. He was not sure yet what kind of man the new one would be. He thought, looking back at the dunes, that the answer to that question was going to be the work of the next 40 years. The Pacific moved beneath the zodiac in long gray pulses, the same pulses it had moved in at dawn, the same pulses it would move in long after every man on the boat was gone. The wind off the water carried the smell of kelp and old wood and something colder underneath, something mineral and ancient. The dunes watched the boat go. They had watched a great many things. They would watch a great many more. And the sand, grain by grain, went on covering what it had been asked to cover, because that was what the sand had always done, and what it would always do, and what it would still be doing long after the men who walked across it had forgotten their own names.